Welcome back to Proxammer, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about Craftworld Eldar Warwalkers, and we're going to be trying to make a case for them in competitive play. We're going to be talking about if they're actually worth taking competitively. I know a lot of players take Warwalkers, myself included, because they were once the meta powerhouses of the Eldar Codex, and a lot of people bought 3 units of them. So a lot of us have spare Warwalkers lying around in droves. But recently, in the competitive scene at least, there's not too many people running a whole lot of Warwalkers. We're definitely not seeing 3 units of 3 as we used to in the old days in most people's tournament lists. However, I actually think that Warwalkers have a case to be one of the more competitive options if you're looking to alpha strike enemy units. So let's dive right into it and let's talk about why I think that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do an overview of the stats, weapons, and special rules of Warwalkers. We're going to be looking at why Warwalkers are underrated and underused in the more competitive scenes. And we're going to be looking at the thing that Warwalkers can do that other heavy support choices can't. And lastly, we're going to be looking at an example of the Warwalker Alpha Strike, which can be very effective at devastating enemy units before they even have a chance to hit back. So looking at the stat line of the model, it comes in at 55 points, which is pretty reasonable for what it gets. It has high movement speed at movement 10. It can move very fast, reposition very easily, and it has a decent save at 3+. It also has toughness 6 and wound 6, which is a decent defensive profile considering the cost of the model. And not for nothing, but it also has 3 attacks, so it's not that bad in close combat when it really comes down to it. As for weapon options, it has the Eldar Missile Launcher and Bright Lance as its anti-tank. The Eldar Missile Launcher is a more versatile weapon, however, and it can hit infantry, albeit not as effective as a dedicated anti-infantry or anti-tank option. However, it does also have the longest range at 48 inches. So this is a very versatile choice. I like to call this choice the jack of all trades, can kind of do a little bit of everything. Whereas the Bright Lance, on the other hand, is purely a dedicated anti-tank weapon. It has a pretty decent punch, strength 8, AP -4, and damage D3+3, which is strong, especially since you can take 2 of them on this guy. However, the unfortunate part about the Bright Lance as of recently is things are getting tougher. So that means, with the new Demon Codex, you have a lot more tougher units, and the AP is not going to matter as much. So Bright Lances, unfortunately, are just not hitting like they used to. Again, some of these armies that are starting to come in. Tyranids, for example, have an invul save against this stuff. Imperial armies just got a recent boost in toughness on most of their vehicles. So it's going to be kind of hard for the Bright Lance to be what it used to be when you have all these toughness increases across the board on several different armies. But having said that, it still packs a pretty decent punch for its cost. As for the anti-infantry options, the scatter laser is really good with dealing with enemy light infantry and, honestly, heavy infantry. I know that doesn't seem like it would be effective, but there's so many shots of this thing. Regular Space Marines will die just as easily in most cases, especially when combined with debuffs. The Shuriken Cannon is geared more towards killing models with 2 wounds specifically, but has a shorter range, a little more AP, and the Shuriken keyword, which means that if you roll a 6 to wound, you get some extra AP on it, and you can benefit from stuff like Blade Storm. Stratagem, that is. And lastly, we have Star Cannon. Now, the Star Cannon is interesting. It's pretty niche, though. It's a niche weapon. It's really only effective at killing 2 wound models that are more on the expensive side that may be a little bit higher in toughness. So things like jet bikes, Primaris Space Marines, things like that. It's really good at taking out those kind of targets. However, its lower number of shots does mean that it's going to be relegated to killing units that are of lower model count. So it is a little bit niche. It does have its applications, but in general, the Star Cannon is not something you typically take when bringing your list to an all-comers game. As for special rules, it has the Explodes ability, but thankfully to a much lesser extent than our grav tanks. Right? Only units within 3 will suffer 1 mortal wound versus the D3 mortal wounds within 6 inches that other tanks have. And it also has a power field, which gives it a 5+ invuln. So this makes it much more durable, and especially when you combine it with Strands of Fate, if it's needed, this can be a very durable option for dealing with 1 or 2 anti-tank hits from last cannons or missile launchers or anything like that would normally target something like a Warwalker. And lastly, this ability is pretty much overlooked on Warwalkers because Warwalkers seem to be kind of a backline artillery style kind of unit that has mobility, but this is extremely powerful on these guys because it allows them to actually get line of sight on targets that they would normally not have access to. So this is something that a lot of players discount, but the fact of the matter is that Warwalkers can get into positions that your opponent will not expect to be able to shoot their most vulnerable units. And that in and of itself, I think, is the key to using Warwalkers effectively in competitive play. But then we just looked at their stats and they don't seem that bad on paper, right? They seem actually pretty good. They have good weapon options, they have good special rules, they're pretty durable, and they can ignore line of sight basically by using their advanced positions to get around pieces of obscuring terrain. So why are Warwalkers so underrated and underused? Well, the primary reason I think is because they can't really be buffed with the Runes of Fate or other buffs because they're not core units. So Guide, Doom, Fortune doesn't work. The other thing is that they use up a heavy support slot, and our best anti-tank units are in this category, and typically you would rather select one of those. I'm talking about D-cannons, I'm talking about fire prisms. Those are absolutely essential for killing the biggest and baddest things on the board, especially with the current state of the game. You have things like Tyrannid, you have things like the new Chaos Demons, which D-cannons are very effective against. And fire prisms just don't pack the punch that those units do against tanks specifically. Also, they're kind of expensive for the damage they can produce. Now, they do have a lot of cool special rules, but the damage they can produce against those specific harder targets are, well, to be honest with you, a little bit lacking, especially since they don't have the capacity to be buffed that easily. And lastly, having no battle focus and with Fire and Fade now being limited to once per game, Warwalkers do not have a reliable way of moving back and forth behind obscuring terrain. So once they commit, they only really have one use of Fire and Fade, and then that's it. They have to commit after that. So that can also be a little bit of a thing that limits their potential in the competitive scene. However, I actually think that Warwalkers can do something very important that other heavy support choices can't in the beginning of the game. Warwalkers are adept at getting line of sight on enemy units turn 1 with advanced positions. This is not something D-cannons can do. Even though they have indirect fire, they suffer from a little bit of range, so you may be out of range turn 1. And fire prisms cannot draw direct line of sight to units behind obscuring terrain or line of sight blocking terrain because they do not have indirect fire. They also don't quite have the speed necessary unless you want to really put them in an exposed position to be able to hit those targets behind obscuring terrain. Even speed 16 doesn't quite get you there in a lot of cases. So, Warwalkers have the advantage in this in that they don't really need those things to be effective turn 1, right? They can use this special rule to completely negate the enemy's ability to hide their units behind obscuring terrain. And that in and of itself can be game-winning in certain situations. So what I want to do is I want to show you guys a couple of examples really of different deployment types and how you would deploy your Warwalkers to negate as much line of sight as possible. So in this first example, we have 3 units of Warwalkers, so a little heavy. You probably don't need 3 units of them, but for the sake of the example, I went ahead and did it anyway. Now, as you can see, the enemy deployment zone is the diagonal deployment, so you would be deployed on the bottom left, and your opponent would be deployed on the top right. Your Warwalkers are deployed on the top left, just outside of 9 inches of their deployment zone, and as you can see, even outside of 9 inches, they're able to draw line of sight on basically all of his units. So his tanks, his dreadnought, his infantry units, pretty much everything behind that ruin. On the right side, it's a semi-similar situation where they can actually draw line of sight to two of the units, the tank and the infantry squad. Now, this may vary a little bit, but essentially what's going to happen is your enemy is going to have nowhere to deploy safely, and you can deploy your warwalkers afterward to get the best line of sight on them. Alternatively, you could set up a unit of warwalkers with advanced positions early on the top left, and basically force your opponent to rethink how he's going to deploy his units. So maybe he thinks, well, I can't hide them anymore, I might as well just put them in the ruin. And at this point, this is actually an advantage to you as well, because now the rest of your army can shoot them, right? So either way, it's a win-win for you. Either the warwalkers get a good shot, or they're put into the ruins and the rest of your army can shoot them anyway, warwalkers included. So this is a really powerful ability, and in this specific deployment type, it is pretty easy to get line of sight behind things like ruins and stuff because of how the deployment is if you have advanced deployment or advanced position units. But let's go ahead and take a look at the horizontal deployment and see if that is any different. And as you can see by this example, it's not really that different. You can still deploy your warwalkers outside of 9 inches of the deployment zone, and it does depend on, to be honest, how your terrain is set up on the board. But in most cases, it will be set up something like this to where you can probably get line of sight on at least a couple of their units in the backfield behind obscuring terrain. So as you can see here, the dotted line represents their line of sight, and they can see basically everything behind that obscuring terrain. So there is absolutely no chance with this setup that your opponent can actually hide from a warwalker unit using advanced deployment. Now, I do realize there are some different types of deployment, but in general, it's kind of mostly the same thing. Warwalkers with advanced positions can easily get line of sight on these types of units. And here's the thing, I didn't mention this because I felt like maybe it was assumed, but when you're using advanced positions, if you get the first turn, you can then move your full distance, which is an additional 10 inches. So you won't always want to do this because you want to keep your warwalkers a little bit away from enemy troops at least so they don't get killed immediately. But if you are running some sort of alpha strike, you can move these guys up to 10 inches and still shoot. And this will grant you full line of sight regardless of any other deployment or special rules that your opponent tries to utilize against you. Your warwalkers are going to be able to see their tanks. You're going to be able to see their most vulnerable units, whether it be tanks, infantry, whatever. And the cool thing also is that usually your opponent is going to want to hide their most vulnerable units behind obscuring terrain. So this gives your warwalkers the chance to get into the belly of your opponent, to get into its soft spots, its vulnerable spots, right? To be able to do the most damage and cripple them before they can strike. So in conclusion, even though warwalkers may not be the hardest hitting unit due to their, well, let's be honest, inability to benefit from certain buffs that are really quite powerful, their real strength lies in their ability to circumvent line of sight with advanced positions to reach enemy armies' most vulnerable targets. This is really where they thrive. And I think this is probably the better way to use them in this meta right now, especially with all the kind of alpha strike kind of lists coming out. And with that in mind, I do think warwalkers have a place in a style of list like that because of their advanced position ability. And the cool thing also is that, if you don't get first turn, you can always put them in strategic reserve. And when they are in strategic reserve, they are safe from enemy shooting, and they can come out and they can pretty much shoot anything on the board from then on, right? When they do come in. So there's that as well. So I originally, when the Codex first came out, thought that warwalkers were a pretty solid choice, and I even have a tier list where I rate them pretty high. I think I rate them in A tier, which I still believe that they are. But I didn't give them much credit in the ultra competitive scenes. I didn't think they were ultra competitive, but I'm starting to rethink that a little bit. I think that maybe a unit of these guys using advanced positions could do a lot of damage to enemy units that are trying to hide behind obscuring terrain. And with that, I think that I'm probably going to be trying some warwalker lists soon, trying to play around with some alpha strike mechanics with warwalkers and see how that works out. If you guys have any questions or comments about Warwalkers, that you've used them a lot or that you have experience using them, please do leave them in the comments. I would love to hear you guys' input on this. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out, and I'll see you guys later. Have a good one, everybody.